Continuing Cato the Younger, from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Those who kept the passages gave way to these two only. It would not let anybody else pass. Yet Cato, taking Manetius by the hand, with much difficulty pulled him through along with him. Then going directly to Metellus and Castor, he set himself down between them, to prevent their talking to one another, at which they were both amazed and confounded. And those of the honest party, observing the countenance and admiring the high spirit and boldness of Cato, went nearer and cried out to him to have courage, exhorting also one another to stand together and not betray their liberty, nor the defender of it. And usually the more honest party is the one that suspends judgment, rather than just repeating or extending accusations against the other. Just because it's possible and it hasn't been proved wrong doesn't mean it's the sort of thing that you bring up against people, right? Then the clerk took out the bill, but Cato forbade him to read it, whereupon Metellus took it and would have read it himself, but Cato snatched the book away. Yet Metellus, having the decree by heart, began to recite it without book. But Thermus put his hand to his mouth and stopped his speech. Metellus, seeing them fully bent to withstand him and the people, cowed and inclining to the better side, sent to his house for armed men, and on their rushing in with great noise and terror, all the rest dispersed and ran away, except Cato, who alone stood still, while the other party threw sticks and stones at him from above, until Murena, who he had formerly accused, came up to protect him, and holding his gown before him, cried out to leave off throwing, and in fine, pursuing and pulling him along, he forced him into the temple of Castor and Pollux. Metellus, now seeing the place clear, and all the adverse party, fled out of the forum, though he might easily carry his point. So he commanded the soldiers to retire, and commencing in an orderly manner, began to proceed to passing the decree. But the other side, having recovered themselves, returned very boldly, and with loud shouting, insomuch that Metellus' adherents were seized with a panic, supposing them to be coming with a reinforcement of armed men, fled every one out of the place. They being thus dispersed, Cato came in again and confirmed the courage and commanded the resolution of the people, so that now the majority were by all means for disposing Metellus from his office. The Senate also being assembled, gave orders once more for supporting Cato and resisting the motion, as of a nature to excite sedition and perhaps a civil war in the city. But Metellus continued still very bold and resolute, and seeing his party stood greatly in fear of Cato, whom they looked upon as invincible, he hurried out of the Senate into the forum, and assembled the people, to whom he made a bitter and invidious speech against Cato, crying out he was forced to fly from his tyranny, and this conspiracy against Pompey, that the city would soon repent, having dishonored so great a man, and from hence he started to go into Asia, with the intention, as would be supposed, of laying before Pompey all the injuries that were done him. Cato was highly extolled for having delivered the state from this dangerous tribuneship, and having in some measure defeated in the person of Metellus the power of Pompey. But he was yet more commended when upon the Senate proceeding to disgrace Metellus and dispose him from his office, he altogether opposed and at length diverted the design. The common people admired his moderation and humanity, and not trampling wantonly on an enemy whom he had overthrown, and wiser men acknowledged his prudence and policy in not exasperating Pompey. Lucullus, soon after turned from the war in Asia, and the finishing of which, and thereby the glory of the whole, was thus, in all appearance, taken out of his hands by Pompey, and he was also not far from losing his triumph, for Caius Memmius traduced him to the people, and threatened to accuse him, rather, however, out of love to Pompey, than for any particular enmity to him. But Cato, being allied to Lucullus, who had married his sister Servilia, and also thinking it a great injustice, opposed Memmius, thereby exposing himself to much slander and misrepresentation, insomuch that they would have turned him out of his office, pretending that he used his power tyrannically. A lot of that stuff being used right now, and going back in time to people who aren't in office and saying, oh, everything's bad because there used to be a tyrant sometime, which is, silly, right? Well, worse than silly, but yet at length Cato so far prevailed against Memmius that he was forced to let fall the accusations and abandon the contest, and Lucullus, having thus obtained his triumph, yet more sedulously cultivated Cato's friendship, which he looked upon as a great guard and defense for him against Pompey's power. And now Pompey, also returning with glory from the war, and confiding in the goodwill of the people, shown in their splendid reception of him, thought he should be denied nothing, and sent therefore to the Senate to put off the assembly for the election of the consuls, till he could be present to assist Piso, who stood for that office. To this most of the senators were disposed to yield, Cato only not so much thinking that this delay would be of great importance, but desiring to cut down at once Pompey's high expectations and designs, withstood his request, and so overruled the Senate that it was carried against him. And this not a little disturbed Pompey, who found he should very often fail in his projects, unless he could bring over Cato to his interest. He sent, therefore, from Manatius his friend, and Cato having 2 nieces that were marriageable, he offered to marry the eldest himself, and take the youngest for his son. Some say they were not his nieces, but his daughters. Manatius proposed the matter to Cato, in the presence of his wife and sisters. The women were full of joy at the prospect of an alliance with so great and important a person. But Cato, without delay or balancing, forming his decision at once, answered, Go, Manatius, go, and tell Pompey that Cato is not assailable on the side of the women's chamber. I am grateful indeed for the intended kindness, as so long as his actions are upright, I promise him a friendship more sure than any marriage alliance, but I will not give hostages to Pompey's glory against my country's safety. This answer was very much against the wishes of the women, and to all his friends it seemed somewhat harsh and haughty. But afterwards, when Pompey, endeavoring to get the consulship for one of his friends, gave pay to the people for their votes, and the bribery was notorious, the money being counted out in Pompey's own gardens, Cato then said to the women they must necessarily have been concerned in the contamination of these misdeeds of Pompey, if they had been allied to his family, and they acknowledged that he did best in refusing it. Yet, if we may judge by the event, Cato is much to blame in rejecting that alliance, which thereby fell to Caesar, and then that match was made, which, uniting his and Pompey's power, had a well-nigh ruined the Roman Empire, and did destroy the Commonwealth, nothing of which perhaps, had come to pass, but that Cato was too apprehensive of Pompey's least faults, and did not consider how he forced him into the conferring on another man the opportunity of committing the greatest. These things, however, were yet to come. Lucullus and Pompey meantime had a great dispute concerning their orders and arrangements in Pontus, each endeavoring that his own ordinances might stand. Cato took part with Lucullus, who was manifestly suffering wrong, and Pompey, finding himself the weaker in the Senate, had recourse to the people. At a gang votes he proposed a law for dividing the lands among the soldiers. Cato, opposing him in this, also made the bill be rejected. Upon this he joined himself with Claudius, at that time the most violent of the demagogues, and entered also into friendship with Caesar, upon the occasion of which also Cato was the cause. For Caesar, returning from his government in Spain, at the same time sued to be chosen consul, and yet desired not to lose his triumph. Now the law requiring that those who stood for any office should be present, and yet whoever expected a triumph should continue without the walls, Caesar requested the Senate that his friends might be permitted to canvass for him in his absence. Many of the senators were willing to consent to it, but Cato opposed it, and perceiving them inclined to favor Caesar, spent the whole day in speaking, and so prevented the Senate from coming to any conclusion. Caesar, therefore, resolving to let fall his pretensions to the triumph, came into the town, and immediately made a friendship with Pompey, and stood for the consulship. As soon as he was declared consul-elect, he married his daughter Julia to Pompey, and having thus combined themselves together against the Commonwealth, the one proposed laws for dividing the lands among the poor people, and the other was present to support the proposals. Lucullus, Cicero, and their friends joined with Bibulus, the other consul, to hinder their passing, and foremost of them all, Cato, who already looked upon the friendship and alliance of Pompey and Caesar as very dangerous, declared he did not so much dislike the advantage the people should get by this division of the lands, as he feared the reward of these men would gain by thus courting and cozening the people. Now, of course, as one knows, I'm opposed to the whole forced marriage of any sort. Whether they had a final choice or not, it's not clear from these accounts, but even in America, most of America's history, consent was not required for either man or woman for marriage. And, the families getting together and deciding that these people should be married was actually more of the decision. Of course, that can be part of your decision, right? Because social alliance is an acceptable reason to get married. And in this he gained over the Senate to his opinion, as likewise many who were not senators, who were offended at Caesar's ill conduct, that he in the office of consul should thus basely and dishonorably flatter the people, practicing to win their favor the same means that were wont to be used only by the most rash and rebellious tribunes. Caesar, therefore, and his party, fearing they should not carry it by fair dealing, fell into open force. First, a basket of dung was thrown upon Bibulus as he was going to the forum. Then they set upon his lictors and broke their rods. At length several darts were thrown, and many men wounded, so that all that they were against those laws fled out of the forum, the rest with what haste they could, and Cato, first of all, walking out slowly, often turning back and calling down vengeance upon them. Thus the other party not only carried their point of dividing the lands, but also ordained that all the Senate should swear to confirm this law, and to defend it against whoever should attempt to alter it, inflicting great penalties on those that should refuse the oath. All these senators seeing the necessity they were in, took the oath, remembering the example of Metellus in old time, who, refusing to swear upon the like occasion, was forced to leave Italy. As for Cato, his wife and children, with tears besought him. His friends and familiars persuaded and entreated him to yield and take the oath. But he that principally prevailed with him was Cicero, the orator, who urged upon him that it was perhaps not even right in itself that a private man should oppose what the public had decreed, that the thing being already past altering, it were folly and madness to throw himself into the danger without the chance of doing his country any good. It would be of the greatest of all evils to embrace, as it were, the opportunity to abandon the commonwealth, for whose sake he did everything, and to let it fall into the hands of those who designed nothing but its ruin, as if he were glad to be saved from the trouble of defending it. For, said he, though Cato having no need of Rome, yet Rome has need of Cato, and so likewise have all his friends, of whom Cicero professed he himself was the chief, being at that time aimed at by Claudius, who openly threatened to fall upon him as soon as ever he should get to be tribune. Thus Cato, they say, moved by the entreaties and the arguments of his friends, went unwillingly to take the oath, which he did the last of all, except only Flavonius, one of his intimate acquaintance. Caesar, exalted with this success, proposed another law for dividing almost all the country of Campania among the poor and needy citizens. Nobody durst speak against it but Cato, whom Caesar therefore pulled from the rostra and dragged to the prison. Yet Cato did not even thus remit his freedom of speech, but as he went along continued to speak against the law, and advised the people to put down all legislators who opposed the like. The Senate and the best of their citizens followed him with sad and dejected looks, showing their grief and indignation by their silence, so that Caesar could not be ignorant of how much they were offended. But for contention's sake, he still persisted, expecting Cato should either supplicate him or make an appeal. And, of course, one of the things is that sometimes the loudest group is not, the will of the people. And I'm seeing this thing in my country where even if there's a majority vote, and even if there's an overwhelming majority of the population that doesn't want something, they're saying, "Oh, we need to, But when he saw that he did not so much as think of doing either, ashamed of what he was doing and of what people thought of it, he himself privately bade one of the tribunes interpose and procure his release. However, having won the multitude by these laws and gratifications, they decreed that Caesar should have the government of Illyricum and all Gaul, with an army of 4 legions, for the space of 5 years. Though Cato still cried out, they were, by their own vote, placing a tyrant in their citadel. Publius Claudius, a patrician, who illegally became a plebeian, was declared tribune of the people, as he had promised to do, all things according to their pleasure, on conditions he might banish Cicero. As for consuls, they set up Calpurnius Piso, the father of Caesar's wife, and Aulus Gabinius, one of Pompey's creatures, as they tell us, who best knew his life and manners, yet whom they had thus firmly established all things, having mastered one part of the city by favor and the other by fear. They themselves were still afraid of Cato, and remembered with vexation what pains and trouble their success over him had cost them, and indeed what shame and disgrace, when, at last, they were driven to use violence to him. This made Claudius despair of driving Cicero out of Italy while Cato stayed at home. Therefore, having first laid his design, as soon as he came into his office, he sent for Cato, and told him that he looked upon him as the most incorrupt of all the Romans, and was ready to show he did so. For whereas, said he, many have applied to be sent to Cuprus on the commission of the case of Ptolemy, and having solicited to have the appointment, I think you alone are deserving of it, and I desire to give you the favor of the appointment. Cato at once cried out it was a mere design upon him, and no favor, but an injury. Then Claudius proudly and fiercely answered, if you will not take it as a kindness, you shall go, though never so unwillingly. And immediately going into the assembly of the people, he made them pass a decree that Cato should be sent to Cuprus, but they ordered him neither ship nor soldier, nor any attendant, except 2 secretaries, one of whom was a thief and rascal, and the other a retainer to Claudius. Besides, as if Cuprus and Ptolemy were not work sufficient, he was ordered also to restore the refugees of Byzantium, for Claudius was resolved to keep him far enough off, whilst himself continued tribune. Cato, being in this necessity of going away, advised Cicero, who was next to be set upon, to make no resistance, lest he should throw the state into civil war and confusion, but to give way to the times, and thus become once more the preserver of his country. He himself sent forward Candidius, one of his friends, to Cuprus, to persuade Ptolemy to yield without being forced, which if he did, he should want neither riches nor honor, for the Romans would give him the priesthood of the entity considered to be a goddess at Paphos. He himself stayed at Rhodes, making some preparations and expecting an answer from Cuprus. In the meantime, Ptolemy, king of Egypt, who had left Alexandria upon some quarrel between him and his subjects, and was sailing for Rome in hopes that Pompey and Caesar would send troops to restore him, in his way thither desired to see Cato, whom he sent, supposing you would come to him. Cato had taken purging medicine at the time when the messenger came, and made answer that Ptolemy had better come to him if he thought fit, and when he came, he neither went forward to meet him, nor so much as rose up to him, but saluting him as an ordinary person, bade him sit down. This at once threw Ptolemy into some confusion, who was surprised to see such stern and haughty manners in one who made so plain and unpretending an appearance. But afterwards, when he began to talk about his affairs, he was no less astonished at what wisdom and freedom of his discourse. For Cato blamed his conduct, and pointed out to him what honor and happiness he was abandoning, and what humiliations and troubles he would run himself into, what bribery he must resort to, and what cupidity he would have to satisfy when he came to the leading men at Rome, whom all Egypt turned into silver would scarcely content. He therefore advised him to return home and be reconciled to his subjects, offering to go along with him and assist him in composing the differences. And by this language Ptolemy, having brought to himself, as it might be, out of a fit of madness, of delirium, and discerning the truth and wisdom of what Cato said, resolved to follow his advice. But he was, again, overpersuaded by his friends to the contrary, and so, according to his first design, went to Rome. When he came there and was forced to wait at the gate of one of the magistrates, he began to lament his folly in having rejected, rather as it seemed to him, the oracle of, is it a Theo or deity, or is it Daemon? Because there's a difference, but something they treated as a god anyways, than the advice merely of a good and wise man. In the meantime, the other Ptolemy in Cyprus, very lucky for Cato, poisoned himself. Poisoned himself. One of the things that's actually pretty clear is that perhaps you don't attribute religious authority to what the oracle says, but if it's good advice, it's good advice. Of course, I'm not recommending that a person turns to Sibyls and Cassandras to, as that you hire them in their art or whatever, or that you believe in them. But if somebody says something good, it doesn't really matter. It's hard to say that bit concisely, I think, but at least at the moment it is. It was reported that he had left great riches. Therefore, Cato, designing to go first to Byzantium, sent his nephew Brutus to Cyprus, as he would not wholly trust Canidius. Then, having reconciled the refugees and the people of Byzantium, he left the city in peace and quietness, and so sailed to Cyprus, where he found a royal treasure of plate, tables, precious stones, and purple, all which was to be turned into ready money. And being determined to do everything with the greatest exactness and to raise the price of everything to the utmost, to this end he was always present at selling the things, and went carefully into all the accounts, nor would he trust the usual customs of the market, but looked doubtfully upon all alike, the officers, criers, purchasers, and even his own friends. And so, in fine, he himself talked with the buyers and urged them to bid high, and conducted in this manner the greatest part of the sales. Thus, this mistrustfulness offended most of his friends, and in particular Manetius, the most intimate of them all, became almost irreconcilable, and this afforded Caesar the subject of his severest censures in the book he wrote against Cato. Yet Manetius himself relates that the quarrel was not so much occasioned by Cato's mistrust as by his neglect of him, and by his own jealousy of Canidius. For Manetius also wrote a book concerning Cato, which is the chief authority followed by Thracia. Manetius says that coming to Cyprus after the other, and having a very poor lodging provided for him, he went to Cato's house, but was not admitted, because he was engaged in private with Canidius, on which he afterwards complained in very gentle terms to Cato, but received a very harsh answer, that too much love, according to Theophrastus, often causes hatred. Well, nothing wrong with hatred, in itself, but And you, he said, because you bear me much love, think you receive too little honor, and presently grow angry. Okay, well, that's where it's a problem. I employ Canidius on account of his industry and his fidelity, and has been with me from the first, and I have found him to be trusted. These things were said in private between them two, but Cato afterwards told Canidius what had passed, on being informed of which Manatius would no more go to sup with him, and when he was invited to give his counsel, refused to come. Then Cato threatened to seize his goods, as was the custom in the case of those who were disobedient. But Manatius, not regarding his threats, returned to Rome, and continued a long time thus discontented. But afterwards, when Cato was come back also, Marcia, who as yet lived with him, contrived to have them both invited to sup together at the house of one Barca. Cato came in last of all, when the rest were laid down, and asked where he should be. Barca answered him, where he pleased. Then looking about, he said he would be near Manatius, and went and placed himself next to him. Yet he showed him no other mark of kindness. All the time they were at table together, but another time, at the entreaty of Marcia, Cato wrote to Manatius that he desired to speak with him. Manatius went to his house in the morning, and was kept by Marcia till all the company was gone. Then Cato came, threw both his arms about him, and embraced him very kindly, and they were reconciled. I have the more fully related this passage, for that I think the manners and tempers of men are more clearly discovered by things of this nature than by great and conspicuous actions. Cato got together little less than 7,000 talents of silver, but apprehensive of what might happen in so long a voyage by sea, he provided a great many coffers that held 2 talents and 500 drachmas apiece. To each of these he fastened a long rope, and to the other end of the rope a piece of cork, so that if the ship should miscarry, it might be discovered whereabout the chests lay under water. Thus all the money, except a very little, was safely transported. But he had made 2 books, in which all the accounts of his commission were carefully written out, and neither of these was preserved. For his freedman Philargarus, who had the charge of one of them, setting sail from Kencrea, was lost, together with the ship and all her freight, and the other Cato himself kept safe till he came to Corcara. But there he set up his tent in the marketplace, and the sailors, being very cold in the night, made a great many fires, some of which caught the tents, so that they were burnt, and the book lost. And though he had brought with him several of Ptolemy's stewards, could testify to his integrity, and stop the mouths of the enemies and false accusers, yet the loss annoyed him, and he was vexed with himself about the matter, as he had designed them, not so much for a proof of his own fidelity as for a pattern of exactness to others. Now, Mediterranean obviously would be too deep for ancient people to, well, at least this group of ancient people to, dive down and get things, but it's probably, I'm not sure without looking at it, but it's probably closer to the shores of places is probably the more likely sinking place, or if there's some little island or something out there, that would be more likely to crash into it or something. So that's understandable there. And don't do disrespectful things just because it's tradition, or it's just the way, oh, if I'm going to be disobedient, I have to do this. Yeah, don't.